What up with you folks? Today we are drawing a custom racing semi-truck. Let's do it. So you already know the deal. We start with a blank piece of paper, as every good sketch does, or a blank Photoshop document, depending on where you're drawing. Today we're drawing on an 8.5 by 11 piece of printer paper. I usually like to use something like an 8.5 by 14, which is legal size, or even a bigger piece of paper. But I happen to have a whole stack of 8.5 by 11 that I'm just working to get through. So today that's what we're using. And we start by laying out our wheelbase, right? So this is a semi-truck, so it's a little bit longer than a car, which is, cars usually 2.5, 3, maybe 3.5 wheels long. Semi-truck in this particular sketch is a little bit longer than that. And as far as width, it's a little bit wider, probably closer to 3 wheels wide versus like 2 or 2.5 that you might see in a standard car or even a smaller car. And then I just start to work through some of the front fascia. So in this particular sketch, I kind of work from the cabin to the rear. Oftentimes I will, in a regular car sketch or motorcycle sketch, I'll bounce around. Here I kind of start from the front and really get a sense for what that cab is doing, and then work into the rear section. But there's still a little bit of bouncing around the sketch, but not as much as I generally do. And as you can see here, I'm starting to work out some of the front details and where certain vents may be, and then projecting the fender to the far side so that it reads properly, or at least semi-accurately, no pun intended, semi-accurately, in perspective. And I'm building everything off of that front section line, right? Starting to get the cab in. The cab might be a little bit narrow, right? But you know, this is one of what would be many sketches in a traditional design process, right? So this doesn't have to be the only one. And I'm thinking that that rear piece, that rear triangular section, would act like an active aero element, right? So when you hit the brakes, it kind of fans out like that dinosaur from Jurassic Park, helping to brake, to slow the vehicle down even more, right? And give it that extra stopping power. Would it be effective? I don't know. We'd have to test it on track. And starting to look at little aero details on top, or little sensor modules. And then trying to work through, I'm looking here for an interesting front graphic. So instead of just having front window, side window, is there a way that, you know, front window, A-pillar, side window, can that kind of blend into just one seeming sheet of glass? And so we're trying to get that to wrap around. And now at this point, I start to create a little bit of wheel clearance for that rear wheel, and start to look for lines that I can pick up from the front into that rear of the semi-truck. And this is an important part here. As you see that body line from the side, I try to wrap that around the front and have different elements in the front pick up that same body line behind the front wheel there. And you'll see here in a minute that same body line, I try to pick that up through the side of the vehicle as well, right? And what that does is creates a kind of continuity or connectedness between the different parts of the sketch by having lines that wrap around the vehicle, or that stop at one second and then pick up at another section. Starts to create a more holistic design. And there's many ways that you can do that. In this particular moment, I'm quite literally just connecting that line through the side to the front. And this obviously wouldn't be a semi-truck if we didn't have a hitch, right? So I'll spend a couple moments here kind of noodling on the hitch, trying to get that in the proper perspective. And you know, usually they have that kind of keyhole look. So just dropping in a small ellipse and then the little slot there, so that it could, in theory, tow something, right? Could tow essentially pretty much whatever. It's a race truck. I don't know what you're going to want to tow with a race truck, but whatever you choose, it can get the job done. And then right here, I'm starting to cut out sections that we might have some type of bracing or additional something for additional chassis rigidity, especially because it's a race truck. We'd want that extra support so that you're getting less body roll. And if you've ever seen any of these semi-truck races, that extra support is certainly needed. Some of these trucks, I mean, they're coming up. How they stay on the ground and don't tip over through some of these turns, I'm not quite sure. So any additional rigidity, any ways that we can minimize that kind of body roll are welcome. And here I am using a Prismacolor, standard Prismacolor. I'm not using a very thin, so I've made it a point to press as lightly as I can up until this point, so that I have an opportunity to continue to rework certain elements. Now, I'm not entirely satisfied with the way that the base of that windshield kind of wraps into the side of the glass, kind of jogs a little bit in this weird way. So I do take the sketch into Photoshop after this and tweak that a bit and start to give it a bit more of a seamless look, and doesn't kind of have this broken or jagged effect. That I don't like. So we can change that in Photoshop. Oof, Photoshop magic. And again, now just working through some of this surfacing through the front and trying to figure out what some of the details might look like, or how the surfaces are interacting. And obviously we want to give it a proper treatment around that headlight. Putting in the bottom half, or the bottom sections of that far side wheel, to make it look like the vehicle is kind of planted on the ground. And eventually I'll block in a little bit of a shadow as well, kind of coming off that wheel. And I'm thinking here that these sections will be some kind of brake cooling vents, or like a ductwork to pull some of that heat, pull some cool air into the brakes, and eventually it'll obviously come out behind the front brake. And again, working on that far side detail. This is a pretty large flat surface on this section, so I'm trying to work out, give it some detail, right? If it does have this larger bodied slab on the side, you're gonna want door cut lines, little hinges, things like this. Maybe there's some, is it a hybrid and you have an electric plug there or something? But trying to add some interest to these surfaces, at least in a race truck. I mean, everything needs to be functional. So looking for any cool functional details that we can add to kind of spice up some of the more planar surfaces. And then coming back towards the rear here and cutting out a brake duct, or cutting out a vent for the rear brakes, to cool the rear brakes. It might be a little extreme, but it's a race vehicle. We can be extreme if we want. You probably wouldn't see that on a production vehicle, that's for sure. And then I'm kind of cutting out this surface here around the front headlight and adding another little duct. Maybe it's to pull heat away from something. What specifically, I don't know. TBD, but it looks cool. So we're rocking out with it. And at this point, I'm starting to add some light value to start to get some of these shapes to read a little bit, so that in my mind I can start to see things more clearly. I mean, the general form language for this truck is pretty planar, so it's a lot of almost like origami. So you've got surface. There isn't a ton of transitions or voluptuousness. I mean, if you've ever seen a semi-truck, they're pretty much squares. So we could obviously do another sketch where we explore a different form language, but for this sketch, follow that. It's a bit more rigid in its look, and that's okay. If we could do another sketch and change the form language if we'd like. And then that front section there, I wasn't sure initially if it was just going to be a volume. I think maybe there's an engine under there, but I've decided to cut out a section of that to pull some more air in. So if there is an engine, maybe it's a ram air function or something like this, right there on the nose of this vehicle, nose of this truck. And now I'm coming through using the side of the Prismacolor and starting to lay in some more lay in some more volume, start to get that front fender there, just have it set off from the rear volume a bit. So I press a little bit harder, give it a little bit of a shadow, so that the front fender reads as if it's in front of that form. And again, I'm thinking that the light is kind of coming from like a front 3/4. So the top surfaces will be the lightest. The side surfaces will be like your number 2 value, right? Thinking 1, 2, and 3 values if you're only going to use 3 values. And then the surfaces towards the front will be a little bit darker than the surfaces on the sides. That's the thinking anyway. So starting to just lay in some of that value. Again, being pretty light here, not pressing too hard. I attempted to fix some of that funkiness along that windscreen there. Not super successfully, so I will have to go into Photoshop later. And then starting to add a bit more definition along these front surfaces to get things to start to read. And I've still got this massive area up front that is pretty empty. It's also tweaked a little bit. The perspective is a little warped, so we want to be sensitive to that kind of thing. And I do fix that later on in Photoshop. I scan it in and I kind of chop it up over a couple layers and just make some adjustments so that it doesn't read like that far side of the vehicle is falling off a little bit. So I've decided to add this kind of cross member. You figure there's probably a structural member behind there to protect the engine or to protect the radiator or something like this. So instead of just having that cross member there, we put a little guard over it or something that looks a bit more visually interesting than a stamped piece of steel. But generally though, that opening, I've left it as a pretty massive area for air intake. The semi-trucks are pretty large. They have massive diesel motors in most cases. Maybe this is a hybrid. I figure if it's 5-10 years into the future, we'll have, if you see what's happening in F1 with the hybrid electric motors, maybe we'll see that in semi-truck racing. So we could make the assumption that future race trucks will be more electric. And maybe I'll do another sketch later that emphasizes or really speaks to more of that electrification element. I guess the only indication that you might see that this could be electric is that there's no visible exhaust. Although it could just be behind the cabin and not visible, or maybe you'd have to guess and say, oh, it could be electric. But if it was full electric, you might not need all that intake up front. So, seeing as we've got all that intake, we're gonna say this has a diesel motor and maybe it's a hybrid. We're making it up as we go, and that's okay. And then everything has a little bit of thickness. So just trying to make sure that these surfaces don't just come to a hard stop. We'd like these surfaces to have some thickness. Anything in real space has some depth. Even a piece of paper has like a micron, less than a millimeter thickness, but there's still some kind of a thickness there. So we don't want things to read as if they're flat. So where we can, we want to add some volume, add some depth to the shapes and to the forms. And then coming through here, and I'll turn the paper. These pipes basically are the cylinders. So we'll have a core running through the center of the cylinder. I assume that the light's coming from more of the top. And we want to add a little bit more shadow here to show that it's kind of set behind the cabin and set behind that active aero element. And now we come to the wheels. Generally on race trucks, the wheels are pretty solid. Right? You don't see too many like 5 spokes or 6 spokes or things like that. They're generally like almost like a steely, a pretty thick, heavy wheel. Maybe not heavy, but visually heavy wheel. Something that has enough structure to support all that weight and all that power being transferred through them. And the tires here, I'm picking a pretty thick tire, a pretty meaty lip there. And then with those lines, I'm just kind of carving out, tracing out where the light may fall across the wheel surfaces. And then it's almost like paint by numbers. So I kind of draw the outline of where the shadow or where the highlight may be. And then I add that shadow, add that highlight. And it gives the sketch a certain look, it's a certain way to sketch. You don't have to do that. And now I start to come in and, again, kind of outlining where that shadow may be. Because we want the vehicles to look like they're sitting on something. And they're not cars and trucks, motorcycles, whatever. Planes sometimes just sit on thin air, okay? But vehicles generally don't. Wheeled vehicles, that is. So then I like to add, kind of create a little bit of an ombre or a fade or a vignette from darker on the shadow, in the spaces that are closest to the eye, which is around that front quarter, around that corner, that is. And then I fade it out to a little bit lighter towards the edges of that shadow. And the reason being is that when the farther out the shadow is, you're generally going to get a bit more reflected light back into that shadow. Rather than coming in, adding a little bit of value to that front glass. And then I'm ever so gently just kind of ghosting in or hinting at some interior details, like a heads-up display or steering wheel, kind of like that dashboard section that might be in there. It's not entirely legible because I don't want the eye to go right there. That's not the focus of the sketch, but to give it that level of realism, we want to at least address a little bit of the interior, at least to nod to the fact that yes, this thing does have an interior, there's a person in there. Unless this was autonomous, and that would be a whole different thing, which actually could be pretty cool. I think that might be the next sketch. Stay tuned for more. Autonomous semi-truck racing. So again, kind of addressing that corner, adding a little bit of detail there. Usually there's at the end of the windscreen, you've got like your windshield wipers, things like that. So I wanted to add that section there. And now addressing the rear wheel, right? Same deal. It's a pretty thick, pretty deep tire and pretty deep wheel also. So coming through, adding a little bit of value. I try to avoid pressing too deeply or pressing too hard on the Prisma here, so you don't want to get like a super deep black because I do want the darkest values to be closer to that front quarter panel or closer to the front of the vehicle because that is the focus of the sketch. But we do want it to read a little bit. And at this point I just kind of add in that little finishing details and give it some direction. I put in that perspective line at the front wheel and at the rear wheel to make the sketch feel a bit more technical. Usually in my mind I'm using those guidelines to guide the whole sketch. All right, then you add your signature and she's ready to go. See you next time.